Welcome, everyone. My name is Christine Biglin. I'm with St. Mary's County Library in Leonardtown, Maryland. And tonight we have Tracy Kaufman, who is the Network Engagement Manager with Candid, who is the provider of the Foundation Director Professional online database for finding funding for nonprofits. Welcome, Tracy.
Great, thank you, Christine. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Tracy, and I will be leading the session. Give me just a moment as I share my screen. Here we go. We have quite a bit of information to cover in a short time period. Anytime anything I'm saying is confusing or unclear, just feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. I'll try to stop periodically in case there are any questions, and we should have a little time at the end as well. But welcome. We're doing Introduction to Proposal Writing today. So this is really, in a nutshell, a class all about how do you write a grant proposal to a foundation. Specifically foundations. If you're looking how to write a proposal to like government funders, that's kind of its own thing and probably is deserving of its own class. This is all about writing grants to foundations with just tips on how to organize, write, and submit kind of a standard project proposal, as well as information on how to follow up afterwards with a funder. My name is Tracy. As Christine said, I'm Network Engagement Manager at Candid. I've been with the organization for about 15 years now, part of the time as a librarian, kind of working with people one-on-one on kind of their grant seeking progress. And these days, just teaching a lot of our classes. Quickly, what Candid is all about in case you're unfamiliar. Candid is a nonprofit organization made out of two long-standing legacy organizations, which are Foundation Center and GuideStar. Foundation Center has been around a long time, since 1956, and they are the #1 source of data, research, and information on grants, foundations, and philanthropy worldwide. Whereas GuideStar has been around since about 1994, and they are the #1 source of data on the nonprofit sector. And about 3 years ago, Foundation Center and GuideStar merged, became one organization. We changed our name. We're now known as Candid, and now all of the information on foundations, grants, and nonprofits, it all kind of lives in the same place. What our mission is all about is the fact that every year millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Our job is to find out, where does that money come from? Where does that money go? And why does it matter? We do research, we collaborate with tons of partners in the sector, and we do lots and lots of trainings, much like this one that you have joined today. We connect the people who want to change the world to the resources that they need to do it. So by the end of our time together, you should have a pretty good understanding of the basic elements of a grant proposal. We'll go over how to draft a standard project proposal, identify kind of the steps involved in submitting, and talk about how to follow up with funders afterwards, whether you get a yes or a no. Sound good? Okay, so we should start by taking a look at the larger process that the grant writing piece exists within. That grant writing, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. What are the basic steps that you go through along the way? Okay, so here's our general process that we flow through. We start with our planning, which is, what do you need the money for? From there, we move into research, which is, who are you going to approach with your grant proposal? Then finally, we sit down and write it. And afterwards, what do we do afterwards? How do we follow up with the funder, whether they say yes or whether they say no? A hot tip also is always follow directions. It sounds obvious, but you'd be very surprised. Planning, first of all. So planning is important because grant seeking is incredibly competitive. There are currently about 1.8 million nonprofits out there in the US, and they're all looking for funding. So you need to be prepared to compete in this crowded field and just have a certain amount of preparation before you set out there to do this. Part of it is about time management. I don't know if anyone has done this before, probably with 55 and counting people on right now. Probably at least some of you have written a grant proposal before. I don't know if anyone wants to hazard a guess or an estimate in the chat about how long it takes between when you turn in your grant proposal, when you submit it, and when you actually get the money. How long do you think it might take after, like, not counting how long it takes to write the thing, but like you submit your grant proposal, how long you got to wait before the money finally comes in? Are you going to have your money next week? Are you going to get the grant next month? On average, it takes between 6 and 9 months between when you submit the grant proposal and when you actually have the money in hand. So it takes a long time. Grant money is slow money. If you need a certain amount of money raised by this time next month, that is what individual donors are for. They're much faster and more flexible for like fast changing financial needs. Overall, the recommendation is give yourself a full year to be safe between when you start preparing to submit a proposal and when you might actually want to be able to use this money. So it's less about thinking like, oh, where do I need to be financially this time next month, and more, where do I need to be financially this time next year? Also, planning is about what type of support do you need? Which project of yours are you looking to fund? Is it a new project that you're piloting, or is it one that you've been running for a little while that you think it's time to take it to the next level and bring it around to some foundations to see if they're interested? Or are you looking for general operating support, like unrestricted funding for overhead costs? Whatever it is, it's important to know it as you're setting out, because funders don't do vague, they do specific, and you want to be crystal clear on where would this money be going. Okay, the next thing to think about is research. Research is critically important. The number one reason why a foundation doesn't fund something. Why don't they fund something? Like, usually it's nothing personal. It's not because they don't like you. It's not because they think you're doing bad work. Most of you are probably doing outstanding work. The number one reason why a funder doesn't choose to fund something is because they say it's not a fit with their funding priorities. Like I said a moment ago, funders are specific, and this pertains to kind of their giving priorities as well. Just because what you're doing is important doesn't mean that it necessarily aligns with the issue areas that any given funder has outlined, that like, these are the things that we support. So you want to think really, really hard about who are you approaching and why are you approaching them. Overall, you want to strive towards establishing a win-win proposition. Like, obviously, it benefits your organization to get this grant funding, but how does it also benefit the funder? How does it move the funder towards their goals as well as you towards your goals? Not enough grant applicants focus on what's in it for the funder in this situation. So think hard about, what is this funder most interested in funding? Overall, the why is as important as the who. Why should they care about this project, and how does it help them achieve their goals as well as your own? The good news is that the research is pretty straightforward to do. It is not too difficult. Candid has a database, the foundation directory. It's very easy to use. You just type in your subject area and where you're based, and you can find a list of funders who match your criteria. The foundation directory has over 240,000, last I checked, funders within it. And while it is a subscription database, if you go to your local public library through our funding information network, you can use it for free. So tonight's session is being graciously put on by the St. Mary's County Library in Maryland. And so if you go to the St. Mary's County Library, you can use the foundation directory completely for free and do all of your research there. So it's very, very helpful. Christine can always share in the chat anything helpful that you might need to know about how to access the collection. But yeah, research is crucial. And of course, then you got to write the thing. We'll be spending the rest of the time talking about the writing as well as the follow-up here. Also, I don't want to neglect to mention that relationships are also really, really important. You could write the most beautiful grant proposal that has ever been written, and you could do your research and send it to the right place. But if someone else out there has a relationship with the program officer and you don't, they are automatically going to have an advantage. So don't neglect the relationship building along the way. Just the same way that you have to cultivate individual donors, it's really, really helpful to cultivate your foundation funders as well and realize that there are people behind the curtain there doing all of the work. And you can meet these people, you can talk to these people, and you can develop kind of a good working relationship with them as well. And it can really help you quite a bit along the way. Okay. So formatting. Quickly, if we were doing this class, say 20, 30 years ago, we would be assuming that you're all writing a big paper proposal and sending a big cinder blocks worth of paper off to a funder. But these days, most of the funders have moved towards online applications. So it's really nice for the funders. Funders, they love their online applications for a variety of reasons that I could go into, but we only have so much time here. But funders love the online applications, but they're very tricky from the applicant's perspective. As any of you who've been through the grant writing process have probably experienced firsthand. Sometimes an online application will be structured similar to the old-fashioned paper proposal where they just say, send us a 5-page narrative in such and such size font in a PDF by the deadline. And what you do with your 5 pages is more or less up to you in terms of one piece needing more time and another piece needing less time devoted to it. And sometimes they'll have online web portals where they ask you a question and you have a text box. And those are probably especially tricky. Mostly because the hardest thing in online proposals is dealing with really, really punishing word counts and character counts. You have complicated programs and you have all these nuanced ideas that you need to be able to convey here in a proposal. And so when they ask you a complicated, nuanced question that requires a complicated, nuanced answer, and then they say 200 words or less, or a really, really small amount of characters, then a lot of your work is going to be spent trying to boil your complicated ideas down to their utmost essence here. So it's very, very challenging doing that. What is going to help is usually start with a boilerplate generic grant proposal. You're not going to submit your generic grant proposal to any of the foundations as is. But what you're going to do is you're going to use it as a jumping off point. You get all your ideas out for kind of a general grant proposal. Here's how our programs work. Here's our impact, et cetera. And you use that every time a grant opportunity comes up so that you can copy and paste certain things from it. And you can take parts and tailor them and adapt them to different funders and to different types of questions that they ask, but it just gives you something good to work with so that you're never stuck staring at a blank page when a grant opportunity comes up. It's really, really helpful just for getting your best ideas down beforehand and then you can change what you need to change and keep the same, whatever can stay the same. And it's also just good in terms of like if an application loses all of your work all of a sudden, you have a backup. You can copy and paste from your backup and you don't lose everything. Like there have been people at my organization who the night before a proposal, their computer died and they hadn't saved their work and they lost everything because they didn't have a backup somewhere. I think in general, the advice is with your proposal, make sure that you're like copying and pasting from like a Word document, but I would go one further and say use a Google Doc, because a Google Doc is going to be saving along the way and you don't have to keep remembering to save. So whatever you do, just make sure that you have some kind of backups in place so that you don't accidentally lose your work. Okay. So while the formats are going to vary quite a bit, the typical questions that a funder is going to ask you, those are going to remain more or less the same. So the typical proposal elements that you're going to find within your travels are going to include stuff like this. Typical proposal elements will include things like an executive summary. That's going to usually show up on top. The narrative is really the heart and soul of the grant proposal. And the narrative consists of the statement of need, the project description, the kind of organizational background information, and then a conclusion. And then you get a budget and then supporting materials. The budget is the one thing that we're not really going to talk about so much right now, not because the budget is not important, but because the budget is so colossally important that it kind of gets broken out into its own class. There are a lot of funders who look at the budget first before they read any of the beautiful words that you carefully put into your narrative. So sometimes you might want to start with your budget and be very, very careful with it and make sure that like the budget makes sense and that you can hold it up next to the written narrative of your proposal. And you can easily tell that these two documents belong to the same project. But budget is very important. And then supporting materials, they're going to tell you what those are. And I'll go over like kind of common examples of what's included in the supporting materials. There aren't any major questions on anything that I've covered so far, are there? Let's see.
There's one question. How do you get your foot in the door to develop relationships with funders?
Okay, so there's another class that I teach all the time, which is called Intro to Finding Grants, where we talk about this at greater length. And I'll talk about this a little bit towards the end in the follow-up piece. But overall, like, first of all, if you can find a connection in common between you and the funder, use it. Sometimes that connection in common will be someone on your staff. Sometimes it'll be someone on your board of directors. Sometimes it'll be someone from among your donor pool or your volunteer pool. Sometimes it will be like another organization that you work with, that you partner with, or that you're friendly with, and maybe they get funded by that foundation and they can put in a good word for you. Or if you already have any current funders, your current funders are probably the best potential referral to a new funder because they already know you, they already like you, and they can go forth into the world and say, hey, this group here, they do great work. We like them, we believe in them, we support them, and we think you should have a conversation with them. So the first avenue would be exploring if you have connections in common with them and make use of them. Use LinkedIn if you have to. If you don't have connections in common, call them on the phone. There is no rule that says you can't call foundations on the phone. You can do it. And in the foundation directory, they have contact information in there. Use it. Just make sure to kind of prepare yourself first and make sure that you come up with like a couple of good questions that you want to ask them, and be prepared to have like a good human being to human being conversation with these people, and like keep it concise, to the point, and it kind of starts greasing the wheels a little bit so that you can begin to have a relationship, so that like once you turn in the proposal, it's not literally the first time they've ever heard of you before. Like, not that it doesn't happen sometimes. Sometimes someone can turn in a proposal cold and still get the grant, but it's a lot harder. It doesn't happen as often as when like you can have a conversation with someone first. Does all that make sense? Great. Okay, and we'll have time for more questions a little further in, but let's go through what are all of these different elements about in the grant proposal. What do funders really want to know? Overall, what funders really want to know from you, they want to see you make a compelling case for support. This is supposed to be a piece of persuasive writing here. So think about what persuades you and let that kind of inform your writing. Are people persuaded by a dry, dense academic style of writing? Maybe a few people, but like it's harder to get to the meaning of the writing if it's obscured by like a dry, dense academic style. Overall, you want to go for like kind of a very clear, direct writing style. Like the type that you find in journalism, for instance, is a good style to emulate, because if you think about the way newspaper articles are written, they're written to be understood. And they're written to be understood by a variety of audiences. You don't necessarily know whether the person reading your proposal, and there's probably multiple people reading your proposal, whether they're an expert in your subject matter or not. So you need to be prepared for either outcome. The best style that I have heard recommended is to like write as though you were writing for a highly intelligent high school senior. Like assume that whoever's reading this proposal can kind of connect the dots on things and that they're a reasonably intelligent person, but don't assume that they understand all the things you're talking about. Like try to avoid jargon, try to avoid too many acronyms if you can, and just aim for something clear and direct, and make use of a little bit of storytelling as well. So that's all involved in making a compelling case for support. Overall, a mistake that sometimes people make if they're not as experienced in dealing with foundations is that they think of a grant like a donation. But a grant isn't really quite like a donation. It's more like an investment. And if you treat a foundation grant like an investment, then you're probably going to have a little more success in getting grants. So really, a grant is an investment in your organization. It's an investment in your community and in your constituents. It's an investment in your issue area. And like with any investment, a funder wants to see a high return and a low risk. So like in a business context, a high return on investment would be financial. And this is not the case here. The funder doesn't want to make their money back with interest or anything like that. But a high return on investment from the funder's perspective is impact. Like the higher the potential impact that they can see here, that is what would be a high return on investment. And a low risk is what it sounds like, just a low risk that something's going to go horribly wrong along the way. So just being able to demonstrate, can you carry out this project in the most effective and efficient way? So funders really want to know the answers to a series of questions. And we're going to go through these one by one, so you don't need to like write them down as fast as you can or anything like that. But the questions that they want to know answers to are, what specific need are you addressing? What are you trying to achieve? What is your strategy for making this happen? How will you know if you're successful? Why are you the best organization to do this work? And how will the project sustain itself in the long run? That's what they want to know. So let's go through these one by one. Okay, first we've got what specific need are you addressing? So this speaks to the need statement piece of your narrative. In general, the narrative of your grant proposal, it will often begin with the need statement. You could do a little rhyme for it, lead with the need. So the need statement, sometimes beginners can misconstrue what it means, like when they say need statement, and they think, this is where we get to say how desperately we need the money. But unfortunately, you never really get to say how desperately you need the money, because that would make you seem like a risky investment. The need statement, rather, is about what is the need in the community that your programs exist to solve. So think about, why does your organization exist? Why do your programs exist? What happens if they don't exist? So thinking about what problem does your organization and your programs aim to solve? And why should this funder care? And be able to back up your claims with facts and statistics that are relevant to the population that you serve and relevant to the geographic area that you exist in, and also that fit the size and scope of your solution. So like if you're talking about like a global problem, but you're only solving the problem in a very, very narrow geographic area, you don't necessarily want to use like international level statistics if you could find like more local level statistics. If anyone needs a place to look to find kind of statistics and data that you can put into your needs statement, let me know. I got resources for that. But really, you just have to be able to back up your claims, that just saying that something is a problem isn't enough. You don't need to like pack your proposal with tons of statistics. One or two really good pieces of evidence will take you a long way, as long as they're relevant. So it's really all about thinking, what is the problem out there? The needs statement doesn't really talk about the solution yet. You got the whole rest of the proposal to talk about your solution to the problem. But thinking about like the community that you operate in, what do they need? What do they not have that they need? And why is the lack of that thing a problem? And then after addressing the need, you're going to be able to take the funder on a journey from before to after. Before your programs existed, and then moving through a logical progression towards what's the place like after your programs have existed? How are things different? How are people's lives different? It's like a journey from problem to solution. That is really the journey that your grant proposal needs to take its reader on. Does that make sense? And so as you're talking about the need that you address through your programs, also be careful not to paint such a grim picture that the situation seems hopeless. It needs to read like a problem that is capable of being solved. Otherwise, it might seem like no matter how much money a funder throws at this, that like, oh, it's a hopeless situation. Make sure that there's a silver lining here. Okay, so after you've outlined what the problem is, now we start prepping ourselves to talk about the solution to the problem. So what are you trying to achieve? How do you plan to solve the problem that you addressed in the needs statement with measurable outcomes? So this piece here, what are you trying to achieve? This is your statement of your project's goals and objectives. Goals and objectives, they're similar, but they're a little different. Goals are going to be broad and general about what you plan to accomplish, and objectives are going to flow from those broader goals, and those are going to be specific and measurable. If you need a little more thought for what your objectives are, there's a good acronym for the qualities that your objectives of what you're trying to achieve, of what they should have. The acronym is SMART. You need to identify things that are specific, that are measurable, they're achievable, they are results oriented, and they're time bound. So if your objectives have all of those things in common, then you have good objectives there. Making sure that you can potentially track over time the extent to which you are achieving your objectives, because there are things that can be measured, because they take place within a defined time frame and they're oriented towards results rather than the activity that leads to the results. And you need to set objectives that are actually realistically achievable, that like you can actually say it. Like if you're running a tutoring program, for instance, think about, okay, how many people are you going to be serving within this tutoring program? Of that number, how many do you realistically think you're going to be able to improve their grade point average? By how much? And how long is it going to take? Will it take like one academic year or a different time frame? It's important to kind of think about that. And while you're thinking through your goals and objectives, also think about whether this issue that you're dealing with, is it already being addressed by somebody else out there? And if so, how will your solution be different from other solutions that exist out there? Okay. Oh, I see in the chat about the SMART acronym. Okay, it looks like some of you are already typing in what the SMART acronym stands for. Thank you for doing my job for me. Yes, specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, time-bound. That's it. Linda's got it. Okay. Okay, so as you've identified what is the problem, you've identified how you want the problem to ultimately be solved and life to be better in a specific way. Now, you've identified the before and what you hope the after to be. Now you gotta fill in the in-between parts. What happens in between before and after? Your methodology, that's what happens. So what are your strategies for making all of this happen? What methods will you use to accomplish your goals and objectives? So this involves identifying your specific plan of action. So thinking about, how will your plan be implemented? Who will do the work? What exactly will happen? Where will it happen? When will it happen? This reads like a timetable with a step-by-step plan for how you intend to accomplish this. In some ways, this piece here, writing about the methodology behind your program, is one of the hardest parts of the proposal to write, because it's hard to make this part interesting and readable. It almost reads like a recipe. First we do this, and then we do this, and then we do that. And it's harder to keep the momentum going here. So you might need to play around with kind of like altering your sentence structures a little bit and having like some short sentences, longer sentences, starting things with different types of words, trying to have a little extra blank space if possible. Like if the format allows for you to use like bullet points sometimes to identify key pieces of a program, that can help a little bit. It's a little tricky sometimes. When talking about your methodology, in here, you want to emphasize any collaborations and partnerships if you have them. Partly because if you have them, then it is part of your methodology that like part of how you get the work done is through collaborating with these other people or groups in the field. But also funders love collaboration. Funders really like to see organizations working together for a greater impact rather than just duplicating each other's efforts in a silo. Also, if you think that your project could be replicated somewhere else by someone else, talk about that too. Funders care about two things more than anything else. Funders care about credibility and they care about impact. So if you can demonstrate that you are a credible organization and that you have a really big impact, you're going to do great. You want to exude credibility and impact from your grant proposal. And when we talk about whether your project can be replicated in another time and place, that shows potential for greater impact. This means that if someone funds your project, their funding really has legs. Their funding will have a longer lasting and greater reaching, further reaching impact. If this is something where if it succeeds, it can be done again in another city, in another state, in another country. Funders will love that. So talk about it if you can. So all of this is kind of the meat of your proposal, showing what happens between the before and the after here. See, we got a lot of activity in the chat here. I like this idea of adding an E to the end of the SMART acronym for equitable. Yeah, like I think it's great if you can add equitable as another quality that your objectives should have. That's a great one. I'm going to bring that back to my team and suggest we add that to our classes here. Okay, so you talked about the problem. You've talked about how you're gonna solve the problem. Now, how do you know if you're successful? This is where we talk about evaluation. And evaluation is an area that gets really jargony, but it's really just, did your programs work? Did you do what you said you were going to do, and were lives changed in the specific measurable way that you said they were going to change? So how are you going to evaluate your project? Evaluation, it helps funders to understand your impact, but it helps you to understand your impact as well, to figure out the extent to which you achieved your goals and objectives. And like if you have a new program, this is an art, not a science. And if at the end of the year, you haven't necessarily gotten where you felt you needed to be in terms of your outcomes and your results, it's not the end of the world, but the evaluation gives you good information to go on so that you can kind of adjust things for the following year and hopefully get even better results. So think about those objectives that you outlined for your program. You want to specify your program objectives in measurable terms, and from there you're able to identify KPIs based on those objectives. So KPIs, we probably have a kind of a mixed experience level in our group here. We usually do. KPIs is just key performance indicators, which is a term that I hate. I turn into the wolf man whenever I hear the phrase key performance indicators, but it comes up, so it's just important to be aware of it. It's just, what are the specific good things that when they happen, you know that you're on the right track towards achieving your objectives? That's what it means when we talk about key performance indicators. So the way I like to think about key performance indicators, KPIs, is to think about like pretending that we're towards the end of a very long, cold winter, and we're eager for spring to come. What are some of the things that when they happen, we have a pretty good idea that spring is on its way? Think about it for a sec. How can we tell that spring is on its way? You could look at stuff like daily temperatures. Is the temperature beginning to rise from one day to another day? Yep, I see in the chat we've got someone suggesting temperature. That's one. Anyone have other ideas they want to pop in? What are other things you could look at that would indicate that spring is coming? Buds on trees, or like some of those early flowers that come up, like a crocus that comes up before any of the other ones, or later on you got like daffodils and tulips and things. Birds, length of the day, that's a really good measurable one. Talk about measurability. So how much daylight you got what time is the sun rising? What time is the sun setting? That's something you can track day by day by day. Are people outside again? Change of clothes. How about allergies? People's allergies are kicking up. There are tons of these different things, so that if your program, if you were running a nonprofit that's key program was just Operation Make Spring Happen, these could be among your KPIs. So you just take the same general idea and apply it to your programs. What are the kind of the signs and signals that you're on the right track for things? Okay, so keep in mind that some things are easier to measure than others. I don't know if we got any arts organizations in the group here, but I know like arts organizations often really struggle with trying to come up with like some good key performance indicators and evaluating impact and things. If we have arts organizations who need help with this, let me know, because I have a good resource for that from Americans for the Arts. Really, really good. But mostly you want to make sure when you're evaluating your project that you've got both quantitative and qualitative measures of success. So quantitative is just numerical measures showing that you're succeeding, and then qualitative is stories. So we got like numbers and not numbers, the head and the heart, they sometimes call it. And you can't really have one without the other. You need to have some element of both, ideally. Sometimes you will have more of one available than the other. Like if you just don't have a whole lot of numbers to go by, you may have to lean more on qualitative measures of success and have more like quotes and stories and things like that. Surveys can be really good for collecting, honestly, both quantitative and qualitative data that you can use. But like a good example of something that is hard to measure, let's pretend that we are running a mentoring program in a high school aimed at raising the self-esteem of teenage girls. How do you measure the success of that? How can you measure whether someone's self-esteem is going up? It's a very nebulous thing. So quantitative things that maybe you could look at to see whether you are successfully raising the self-esteem of the teenage girls in your mentoring program. You could look at, say, are we seeing lower rates of detention? Are we seeing fewer absences from school? Fewer fights? Higher grades, higher test scores? If you just see like one of these things improving, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if you see a few of these things improving at once, then like it starts to paint a picture, and you can probably start attributing some of that to the success of your program. So that's all quantitative. Qualitative things, you could get quotes from their teachers, you could get quotes from parents, or you could have the girls in the program kind of keep a journal as part of the program and kind of like get some stories and testimonials from that. You could see like more involvement in student activities in general. Like all of these things come together to paint a picture. So think about like what this means for your own programs and how you can demonstrate that you're having an impact, that you're changing lives in some kind of measurable way. So think about what's the data that you need and how can you collect it and analyze the activities on an ongoing basis. Like don't set it and forget it. Don't say like, here are the things we're going to measure and then not measure them until like the end of the year, because then you miss an opportunity to course correct along the way. Like halfway through the program, if you see that you're not on track, you could like have an opportunity to change some things in the way you're doing the work so that you can have better results. Or if it just looks like, yeah, you're just not going to meet your outcomes this year, at least you're able to say, let the funder know, so that like they're not surprised at the end of the year and at the end of the grant period, because funders don't like surprises. They're very, very risk averse. So that kind of takes you to the end of your program, but then it's time to back up from the programs and look at the organization as a whole. All right, so you have these great ideas about social change. You identified a problem in the community and you talked about how you're planning to solve the problem and you proved that it works. Now, why are you the best organization to do this work? So this is the part, if you're going to copy and paste something without changing it, this is probably like one of the most likely pieces that you can just copy and paste and you barely have to touch it from one funder to the next. This is where you talk about your mission statement, your organizational history, talk about any other programs or services that you've done, talk about accomplishments that you've had, what's your reputation, what's your visibility in the field. When we talk about credibility and impact, like this is the credibility piece here. You want to establish your credibility. You want to demonstrate a significant track record of success. For this reason, it can be very challenging for a brand new organization to get grant funding. If we have any startups here with us today, if you're a newly established nonprofit, it's much, much harder to get a grant because you don't have a track record yet. So things you can do if you're a new organization. Overall, if possible, you might want to wait a couple of years if you're a new organization before you start applying for grant funding, and maybe start with some individual giving, because it's easier and faster to get, and just to get enough to be able to pilot some programs. And then once you've had a couple of years worth of successes under your belt, you'll be in a better position to approach foundations at that point. But also, another thing you could do is maybe your organization is new, but your people are not new. If you have really great people doing the work and they've done amazing things elsewhere before they got here, and this is just their latest project that they're working on, you could lean on that. Like whoever's running your programs, whoever's in your leadership, talk about amazing, relevant things that they've done that might kind of paint a picture of a good track record. That's another thing that you could do. But yeah, organizational history. Like, don't make this part too overly long because the funder might forget about what is the program. But just do what you need to do, say as much as you need to say to establish just your history and your credibility. And then we have the final big question here, which is how will the project sustain itself in the long run? This is the financial sustainability question, and it often sounds like a trick question. That really, you'll often think that like, how will we sustain ourselves in the long run? We were hoping that we would sustain ourselves in the long run with a grant every year from you, dear funder. But in reality, a funder doesn't want to be your only source of income. They want to see, okay, how else are you filling out your funding mix? They want to know long-term, what are you going to do after the grant period ends? No one is likely to fund you forever, even if a funder really likes you a lot. They might fund you for a while, but it's unlikely that they'll keep going forever and ever. And you need more than just grants to sustain yourself. So overall, like, what's your business plan, if you want to call it that? How will you support the organization if grant funding is not readily available? You want to kind of be able to demonstrate diverse funding streams. Like if you have other funders, mention that. It doesn't count against you. It can only help. Do you have a lot of money coming in from individual donors? If so, talk about that. Do you have an earned income stream, like revenue generating activity, charging for goods and services or events or something? Talk about that. Corporate support, whatever you got, talk about it. You don't necessarily have to have an airtight plan, because who has an airtight plan, really? But just let them know that you've been thinking about this and that you have some ideas in place for how you're sustaining this project over time. And then you want to finish strong with a conclusion. I know you're exhausted from writing all the stuff that you already wrote, but you want to finish on a high note. So in the conclusion, you want to talk about, okay, why now should this specific funder fund this specific project? This is where you answer the so what question. If this grant happens, how will life be better? For who? And why should this specific funder care? How will this be mutually beneficial? Like getting the grant, it will benefit your organization. It will benefit the community. Will it also benefit the funder? Will it take them towards their goals of social change too? Let's hope so. And you want to be able to connect the dots for them. Walk the funder to the fit of why you're approaching them with this idea rather than somebody else. Talk about why this makes sense to them. That's the way you can finish on a high note with your conclusion. Okay, and then we got the executive summary. Like these days, not everyone is going to ask for an executive summary, but when they do, it's the piece that's going to come first on top. The 1 to 2 page summary of everything that goes in the full proposal that a funder can look at a glance and have an idea of basically the kinds of things that they might read in greater detail if they so choose. Why are we talking about this now, close to the end, when it's a piece that comes towards the beginning? It's because usually you want the executive summary to be like one of the very last things that you write. You want to write the full proposal first, usually, and then write the executive summary. Because you have to get so much good information into a really finite amount of space if you only have 1 page to do it in an executive summary. So if you write the full proposal first, you get all your big ideas out on paper. And once you've got it all out, now you can sift through and pick out the highlights. Since like the funders who don't read the budget first, they would be likely to maybe read an executive summary first. And so because of that, you want it to be attention grabbing. You want to have really good information there that makes your proposal unforgettable. So if you look through the longer full proposal and you pull out the highlights, what are the most important pieces here that we want to make sure the funder remembers? Pull it out from there. It's going to contain overall miniature versions of everything you find in the full proposal. Miniature version of your needs statement, miniature version of your project description with objectives, miniature organizational background, and also it'll include how much money are you asking for. You don't want to forget that part. Tell them how much you want. And then we get supporting materials. Like I said, they'll tell you what these are. They'll tell you everything they want you to send them. But like some common things that are included in the supporting materials are 501c3 determination letter from the IRS. Your budget, audited financial statements can be a big one. Your 990, your tax returns. General operating budget for the last few years, a list of board members with their professional affiliations. Those are some of the common things that you might find there. And basically send them whatever they asked for and don't send them anything that they didn't ask for. Follow directions. And overall, make sure that everything's legible, easy to read, no typos, no fancy fonts or binders, etc. Again, a lot of this may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised. And if there's something they're asking for that you do not have, use it as a relationship cultivation opportunity. Like let's say audited financial statements. You don't have that. That's a common one that sometimes people don't have. You can call up the funder in that case. You have an opportunity. You have something to call them about. You can call them up and say that you're trying to apply, but you don't have audited financial statements. Is there something that you could substitute instead? And you will get an answer to your question. So that part's nice. And you also just had an opportunity to have a friendly conversation with someone at a foundation. And that's worth its weight in gold. So that later on they'll remember you. They'll be like, that nice person who called on the phone that time. And that it's gonna help having that little bit of a relationship there. All right, so you wrote everything. And now you sit back and wait for what, 6 to 9 months until the money comes in. So, okay, how do you follow up after the fact? So let's say you had some really good luck. You got the grant, hooray. So if the answer is yes, oftentimes they will send you a grant letter from the funder before you get the actual check. You're going to review the grant letter, sign it, and send it back. That's often going to be a really good moment for a thank you letter, because this is not the end of the journey. This is the beginning of a relationship. The funder is your partner now. And maybe it sounds trite to say that the funder is your partner, but they are. So the funder can't do their job without you. It's their job to give out money. If the funder doesn't give out money, they will be shut down by the IRS. So they got to do this. And the funder has the money to make social change happen, but you have the on-the-ground expertise to make the change happen. You need their money. They need your skill set and hard work. You are two halves of a whole. One cannot exist without the other. So that's what makes it really a true partnership there. So other things that are going to come up in your follow-up, you want to keep them informed along the way. Send any required reports on time. There's typically going to be like a mid-year grant report, an end-of-year report. Send those in on time. Let them know about any major milestones or accomplishments that you have along the way, and invite them to events if you have them. They can't always make it to events because they have a lot going on, but they'll remember that you asked and they'll appreciate that you asked. All of this is really good for relationship building and it paving the way for a renewal request to get the grant again next year. And of course, there's no substitute for doing what you said you were going to do with the money. Now, let's say you were less lucky, and the answer is no. So even if you did everything right, even if you wrote a beautiful grant proposal, and even if you did your research and you sent it to the right place and you followed directions and everything, even if you did everything right, that means that there's like maybe a 1 out of 3 chance that you get the grant. Which means even if you did everything right, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that you don't get the grant. So put it into perspective and realize that it's typically nothing personal. No is not always a forever no. You are fully within your rights to ask for feedback. Some funders will be more forthcoming with feedback than others, but you are completely within your rights to ask. And the answers might vary. A lot of times they'll say, there just wasn't enough money to go around this year. We got so many great applicants. We wish we could give grants to everybody, but we couldn't. Foundations, generally, they give out 5% of their assets each year in the form of grants. So like, even though foundations, they seem like their money is limitless, there is a finite pool here. And ask if it's worth your while to apply again next year. And if they say yes, that's the best thing you could possibly hear. If they say, yeah, we like what you're doing, it's worth your time to apply again next year. And if that's the case, then again, keep up the relationship. Keep them informed about your work and your progress, but don't like spam them. Don't put them on your newsletter list. Keep it strategic. Just if you hit like a goal or a milestone or something like that, let them know, or invite them to an event, something like that. Keep up the relationship, but yeah, find out if it's worth your while to apply again next year. But also know if it's time to move on and seek other prospects. Like if you get feedback and they say, it's not a fit for what we do, then okay, if it's not a fit, it's not a fit. Or if you apply just year after year in a row, if it's been like 3 or 4 or 5 years in a row and you still haven't had luck, figure out if this is still worth your time, really. Or if it's time to just kind of move on and seek other prospects. There are hundreds of thousands of funders out there. there are other people who you could approach if that's the case. So figure it out from there. So as we're winding down, if you remember nothing else, some key takeaways. Start with an outline. This is like that generic boilerplate proposal that you're going to write. You don't want to send that proposal word for word to different funders, but you use it as a starting point. It gives you something to work with in the future. Keep the language clear and concise. I cannot overemphasize this, just like be clear and direct with good, simple language that kind of, it's readable and it tells a compelling and persuasive story. Don't cloud your proposal with smoke and mirrors. Say what you mean and say it with energy and commitment and passion. Focus on the funder's interests rather than just your own organizational interests. Make it clear like why you're approaching them with this idea. And follow directions. That's super important. Revise and edit before submitting. Give it to someone else to read. Especially give it to someone to read who doesn't work in your field. If someone who has nothing to do with your line of work can read what you wrote and it makes sense to them, then you're on the right track. I've had colleagues who say that like, oh, give it to your mother-in-law to read, assuming that your mother-in-law doesn't work in the same field that you work in. Just like get a complete outside perspective on any of this. And that'll help you know whether you're making a persuasive case for support. So with that, that's what I got for you. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I know we're running over time, but let me see if I have room to answer a question or two. I see questions about the arts resources. Let me put a really, really special resource into the chat here for any arts organizations in the room that need help with identifying clear, specific, measurable objectives or outcomes. This link I'm putting in the chat right here comes from Americans for the Arts, the Arts and Social Impact Explorer. It takes the arts and makes good, clear, specific, measurable connections between those and a variety of different subject areas, like how do the arts make an impact in the economy or in immigration or health or whatever it is. And it can be really, really helpful. For other issues, first of all, census data can be really helpful, or any other like local government data that you can pull, or any data that you collect within your own organization. But I also have a free resource that Candid creates, which is called Issue Lab. Issue Lab it's a free site. It's a collection of thousands and thousands of different research papers on pretty much every subject matter you could possibly be working in. So for instance, I see someone's writing about social services in the shelter systems. You can search for that in Issue Lab and be able to pull up a variety of research reports on that and get data from that you can cite in your needs statement. I highly recommend this. I use it all the time. Okay, let me see if I can squeeze in any other questions. How long is a proposal? As long as a funder tells you it should be, is probably the easy answer for that. Like a typical length would be between 5 and 10 pages, but the real answer is however long the funder says it is. And nowadays, now that so many funders are doing web portals for their application system, it's not even always necessarily a hunk of pages that you're sending to them. It's just a bunch of text boxes a lot of times. So the landscape is changing for a lot of these kinds of things. Anyone who wants resources on like, what does a good grant proposal look like in real life? I have sample documents for you. Here's another angle of Candid learning. This is from the Candid Learning website. We have in our resource section sample grant proposals, which includes sample letters of inquiry, sample budgets, you name it. And these are just free to download. You'll need to set up like a free like username password thing, but it's all free stuff. And you can download some of these proposals and get an idea of what do they all look like in real life. So that might be helpful for you. One last question, and then I know like we're running way over time, is who reads proposals on the funder's side? That's a good question. A lot of times people think that the program officer makes the funding decisions, but they typically don't. So the program officer at a foundation, and keep in mind, some foundations don't have staff. Some of them, these tiny family foundations, are just literally run by a family, and it's a family reading grant proposals. But if we're assuming it's a foundation that has staff, generally, first, it's going to be people on the program team, program officer or program director, program assistants, all of them, they're reading through your proposals and figuring out whether it's a good fit or not. Do they like it or not? The ultimate decisions are made by the board of directors. That's where the magic happens. And this is why when you're looking at grant opportunities, frequently you'll see like a few different deadlines scattered throughout the year. A lot of times those deadlines align with board meeting dates, because at the foundation's board meetings, they are looking through the grant proposals and making decisions on who's getting the grants this time. So the program officer, if anything, is potentially your advocate. If the program officer reads your proposal and loves it, the program officer can potentially take your proposal to the board of directors and advocate for you and say, this place, they're doing amazing things, and we think you should take a chance on them. So think of the program officer as your advocate rather than the person who has all of the control and the power in making funding happen. Okay, so that's what I got here. And oh yeah, Christine is right that we list other classes that we have available on our website here. If you go to the training calendar, for instance, I'll put a link to the training calendar. You can see what kind of live sessions we might have coming up. I know for a couple of other libraries, I'm doing a class on the budget in November, I think on 2 different dates in the first half of November. So you might want to look ahead to that if anyone needs help with budgets.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This was really a great presentation and you have a lot of wonderful information. But I thank you all for coming. And I especially thank you, Tracy. It's a really wonderful class. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me. And thanks everybody for coming, and good luck out there.